Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Kind of explain the topic of my title. So I think these three words pretty much say it all. I'm going to talk about some drugs. I'm going to talk about some cheesy horror novels. And I'm going to talk about the war in Vietnam. And I'll hopefully show you how all of these things kind of fit together. So where do our beliefs about addiction actually come from? Probably everybody here in this room has a friend or relative that has struggled with drugs or alcohol at some point. And as a result, we might follow scientific studies of addiction, adding empirical data to our experiential wisdom. For many people, including people that are in AA or any other 12-step program, addiction also has a spiritual component, so that our religious beliefs, whatever they might be, also color our understanding of addiction and recovery. Addiction is also, perhaps even predominantly, a problem that's shaped by and understood through culture. You might feel that you can recognize the corniness of the "this is your brain on drugs" PSA from years ago, and maybe you were not affected by that message. Or if you were a child of the 1980s like me, then you probably don't think that Nancy Reagan had anything to do with your ability to not use drugs. But cultural narratives, those stories that we tell about how life works, that we tell through literature, through art, through films and advertising, actually have a long and well-documented effect on understandings of addiction. If you were to go into this library and pick up a 19th century text that deals with addiction, like The Mysteries of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens or Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, you would notice an understanding of drug and alcohol problems that actually doesn't look too much unlike the modern days. In fact, scholar Harry Jean Levine has argued that the medical understanding of addiction was created by literature, and specifically the novel. These early stories didn't just represent addiction, they helped to create the concept. Doctors, clergy, and everyday people used fictional text to help them understand the world around them. Culture combined with experience, science, and religious belief to create the concept of addiction. When a concept undergoes a significant change, we can expect to see that change both reflected in and influenced by culture. For example, prior to the prohibition of alcohol, so that's 1920, many anti-liquor texts would depict the saloon as a place of sin and debauchery that had to be shut down for the good of the innocent women and children that were often the victims of drunken violence. In T.S. Arthur's famous novel, 10 Nights in a Bar Room, we have an illustration from it here, there's a saloon scene in which a young girl is killed by her father when he flings a glass at her head when she comes to the saloon to get him to come home. After the repeal of prohibition, so 1934, this narrative of alcohol problems changed. No longer was the problem the place. Now alcohol problems originated in the person, and that person, despite their drinking, deserved compassion and was worth saving. The film The Lost Weekend, which won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1945, and often ends up on those lists of like years where that film shouldn't have won Best Picture. You can look out for it that way. I still like it, but it depicts an otherwise charming and intelligent man named Don Burnham who struggles with alcohol. But his local bar is a warm, friendly place where other patrons drink socially and moderately. It's Don and his psychology that contain the potential for alcoholism. The creation of a disease concept of alcoholism is one of the most significant changes to the way we understand addiction. Though science, experience, and culture continue to influence us, as a society, we hold to the belief that some people can drink without troubles, but other people cannot. This is reflected in laws that target individual actors for infractions such as public intoxication, rather than corporate entities like saloons for creating or selling the intoxicant. Another important shift occurred in the late 1960s and 1970s. During this time, ideas about who and what could treat or cure addiction underwent radical changes. The creation of the intervention as a therapeutic technique and the subsequent declaration of the war on drugs are artifacts of this important cultural change. These events signaled a shift in the way we understand how to treat addiction and who might be able to do so. I first want to explain what an intervention is and why it's so significant to the history of addiction treatment, although I'm assuming that probably everyone in this room has a rough idea of what one is. In the 1960s, Vernon Johnson, an Episcopal preacher and a recovering alcoholic, established the Johnson Institute to develop methods for early intervention. In his landmark book, I'll Quit Tomorrow, great title, Johnson described the process of the intervention and extolled its benefits. He argued that it was dangerous and unnecessary to wait for alcoholics to reach a rock bottom or feel motivated to enter treatment. Through his intervention, alcoholics could be coerced into accepting help. Successful interveners might include an alcoholic's employer, spouse, family, and friends. They would confront the alcoholic with the effects of his or her drinking, and in doing so, re-represent reality to that person. This person, Johnson believes to be dangerously dissociated from reality. Interveners could write letters describing the drinking behavior of the alcoholic, or even show video or audio recordings of the alcoholic at his or her worst. Within a decade, Johnson's intervention had transcended alcoholism and was recommended for a number of addictive behaviors. So if you've seen shows like Intervention or Hoarders, or a number of others, you've probably seen interventions staged for a variety of addictions. Johnson's work began at the height of what's called the modern alcoholism movement. 3 specific features of this movement are important to point out: the rise of Alcoholics Anonymous, the creation of a disease concept of alcoholism, and the beginning of occupational alcoholism programs. AA and the disease concept humanized the addict, who became a subject worthy of sympathy but also study. AA influenced treatment significantly as doctors and lay people began to see the 12 steps as the most viable path out of addiction. Thus, a narrative of addiction emerged in which recovery came about when one hit a rock bottom, became willing to accept help, and told one's story through AA meetings. We can visualize this narrative, and I've used a still here from Valley of the Dolls to fit with the time period. But we can visualize this narrative by imagining an upside-down triangle that in narrative studies we call a Freytag triangle. If you think back to your literature courses, you may have seen rising action, climax, denouement, sort of the opposite here, right? And we can think of other stories like conversion narratives or the stories in AA's Big Book that follow a similar trajectory to this. AA also influenced occupational alcoholism programs. According to addiction scholar William White, during World War II, employers were much more likely to hire workers with histories of chronic alcoholism for obvious reasons. Occupational alcoholism programs helped keep these workers employed, and the programs established at every level of industry and government leveraged the employer's authority to intervene in alcoholics' lives and shepherd them into inpatient or outpatient treatment, saving their careers, but also saving the employer's money. The sooner an alcoholic could be diagnosed and enter treatment, the greater the savings, both for the company and the alcoholic himself. The concept of early intervention, of coercing an addict to enter treatment before he or she was ready, was anathema to decades of medical study and cultural lore about addiction. They believe that this process has to happen. But Johnson's insistence that the right interveners could raise the bottom, and here I've got a still from Saved by the Bell to show that we moved forward into the future. His insistence that the right interveners could raise the bottom, keep them from hitting the base of that triangle there, increasingly became attractive to groups of people who once felt powerless to help alcoholics. The intervention also changed the shape of the addiction narrative. It's no longer a triangle, it's kind of like a trapezoid, I guess. Important to Johnson's concept of intervention was a new definition of alcoholism and addiction. Johnson said that addiction, not intoxication, was a break with reality. So it's not the fact that you're drunk that you don't know what's going on, it's the fact that you are a drunk, that you don't know what's going on. He insisted that alcoholics and addicts were, quote, by definition, unable to recognize the fact of their addiction. If the alcoholic is coerced into seeing a counselor, he or she cannot be questioned alone. Because alcoholics cannot and often will not answer truthfully about their own habits, quote, it's impossible to find out their behavior by questioning the subject. Authority for what really happened shifts to the addict's employer, their family, friends, witnesses to the behavior whom the counselor can rely on for a true history. Rather than needing to progress downward to a rock bottom, the alcoholic is, as Johnson argues, always already surrounded by crises, no one of which is being used constructively. Interveners can deploy those crises by threatening the withdrawal of support, emotional and financial, long before the addict has intersected with the crisis event themselves. Johnson's intervention dovetails nicely with Richard Nixon's 1971 declaration of war on drugs. Though in some senses Nixon's initiative was a literal war on opium producers, he primarily used this declaration to shape bureaucracy through rhetoric. In doing so, he mobilized a metaphor for understanding addiction that coalesced with Johnson's intervention. While the federal government had previously written and enforced laws both nationally and internationally to fight drug smuggling and diversion, Nixon's war specifically attacked addiction itself. In his address to Congress, he emphasized the treatment and rehabilitation of addicts. In some ways, his war on drugs was more what we would call liberal or progressive than Bill Clinton's, for example. He was in favor of methadone maintenance, just to kind of give you an example. He consolidated the fragmented and piecemeal federal bureaucracy surrounding drugs into a special action office of drug abuse prevention to oversee all federal programs involved in education, prevention, research, and rehabilitation. So it's also a power grab. This consolidation corresponds to the narrative of addiction Nixon deployed when warning Congress of addiction's threat to the nation. Addiction is, quote, an all too often one-way street, beginning with innocent experimentation and ending in death. Between these extremes is the degradation that addiction inflicts on those who believe that it could not happen to them. Nixon's narrative of addiction is a linear progression, or more precisely, a decline that must be arrested and reversed when possible, or preferably prevented from even beginning. Nixon's war paradigm also served political purposes. Calling heroin-addicted veterans a, quote, especially disheartening aspect of the national drug problem, he did little to discourage popular perceptions, both in the media and in Congress, that drug addiction among the military was a pervasive and, in fact, a major hindrance to fighting and winning the war. A New York Times article published in 1972 cited Republican Congressman Robert H. Steele as attributing Nixon's rapid troop withdrawal in 1970 and 71 to an epidemic of heroin addiction among soldiers. According to Nixon's narrative of addiction, drug use and dependency was not caused by environmental factors like poverty or, in the soldier's case, the extreme stress of fighting a war. Neither his termination of President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty nor his continuation of President Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam could be responsible for the uptick in heroin use among Americans. Thus, addiction was an apolitical and non-ideological issue. Nixon could and later would align the war on drugs with the war in Vietnam to make the latter's failure the result not of an ideologically flawed foreign policy, but of an unstoppable disease that affected individuals universally. In this timeline that I'm going to kind of click through kind of fast, but many of these events will probably be familiar to you. You can see how major changes to our understanding of addiction were overlapping with first the war in Vietnam and then the war on drugs. The use of war rhetoric to describe efforts to combat addiction reinforced concerns about agency and imperialism, what we are capable of doing as individual actors and as a nation state. And we'll stop at 1975 there. Jeremy Kuzmarov, who's a historian and author of Myth of the Addicted Army, argues that even Nixon's critics used the war metaphor by equating drugs with the immoral quality of the war and exposing CIA support for regional drug lords. The critics also helped to demonize drug use while playing into the conservative agenda by raising fears about drugs and predominantly supporting the expansion of the war on drugs. So both sides go into the war on drugs rhetoric. If one wasn't for the spread of democracy to Indochina, one could still be against the spread of addiction from the same region, and in doing so, support military intervention. For conservatives and liberals, drugs and addiction became evils in themselves, evils that required immediate action. Emerging at this time of widespread distrust of government and uncertainty about America's military might, the Johnson intervention was a unique corollary to the war on drugs. Intervention enabled the non-addicted layperson to fight against the addiction of his or her loved ones. This narrative was writ large in the war on drugs, as drugs are defined as a threat to the way of American life that requires external authorities to curb its spread. Because of the intervention, the crisis of the narrative of addiction transformed from one of cure to one of diagnosis. So instead of having the big climax of the narrative be you see that you have a problem and you begin your cure, the crisis is now you are diagnosed as an alcoholic and maybe a cure happens later on down the road. Rather than having to progress through the AA narrative of hitting rock bottom, asking for help, and then telling your story, the intervention merely asks the addict to accept the diagnosis of his or her interveners and enter treatment. Addiction scholar William White notes that the coercive influences of family and friends had persuaded addicts to seek treatment throughout history. However, the intervention appeared during a time when coercion was being used at earlier stages in the development of alcohol and drug-related problems. Furthermore, the creation of an anti-drug bureaucracy meant that there were more coercive agents than ever, and that the primary goals of such coercion had shifted toward cultural and institutional gains rather than a restricted focus on personal reformation. The drive to coerce more addicts to enter treatment sooner meant that a diagnosis could stand in place of a moment of spontaneous insight. If Alcoholics Anonymous's recovery narratives emerged from self-identification with this master narrative and retelling one's story as part of the process, what kinds of narratives would the intervention produce? And those are the narratives that I think we see in the period that I want to talk about today. Nixon's approach to combating addiction required increased surveillance of addicts, veterans, and treatment facilities. He defined victory in the war on drugs vaguely and proposed doing away with quantitative measures of success in favor of judging treatment programs based on, quote, the number of human beings who are brought out of the hell of addiction, and by the number of human beings who are dissuaded from entering that hell. Bringing addicts out of the hell of addiction had, as Nixon acknowledged, an incredibly low success rate. Preventing them from entering that hell would necessitate a variety of surveillance activities. Urinalysis of deployed soldiers that was first used in the Vietnam War. Aerial surveillance in Indochina of opium growers. Censorship of film and television. Admonishing parents and wives to watch and be aware of their children's and husbands' suspicious behaviors. Because laxity, not watching closely enough, and not the militarism of the Vietnam War led to addiction, individual and institutional vigilance were required. Nixon's calls for increased surveillance of addicts, drugs, and treatment centers coincided with a widespread interest in the American public's viewing of the Vietnam War through the medium of television. And I like this image, although when you look at it really closely, you can tell that that's actually a piece of paper taped over the television and not something on the television. So it's kind of an interesting image. In critical discussions of the television news media's depiction of the conflict, the paradox of the media's failure to make the war understandable for the rest of the country, despite daily coverage, is a persistent theme. In 1971, sociologist Maury Pollner captured the fierce antipathy of the returning Vietnam soldier to the American media. One Vietnam veteran found himself becoming increasingly enraged at the untruths proliferating about the war in the mass media. He describes the upsetting effect of seeing war footage broken up by commercials for, quote, underarm deodorant or beer. Another veteran found himself both repelled by and attracted to the footage. He says, I try hard to avoid it, but 6 o'clock every night, there I am, staring as if hypnotized at the screen. Despite these statements, Pollner and some of his subjects hold to the belief that Vietnam veterans have been ignored. In fact, what Pollner and the veterans decry is not the neglect or the misrepresentation of the real veteran, but the failure of the mass media to create a satisfactory fictionalized veteran. Historian Kathleen McClancy convincingly argues that none of the commonplace assumptions about the coverage of the Vietnam War had basis in reality. This is a quote from her. The news was not suffused with combat imagery. Soldiers were not portrayed as rabid killers, and not all footage showed American soldiers engaged in horrific atrocities. Rather, she suggests, it was the medium of television that made warfare seem both more dangerous and more mundane, and the soldiers seem less heroic than what war films had conditioned viewers to expect. Fellow historian Kuzmarov similarly privileges the role of television in bolstering popular anxieties about the addicted army and obfuscating the actual facts of war. McClancy further suggests that the viewers of the first televised war became haunted, not because of the war itself or America's defeat, but because of the ways in which popular culture presented it. In his 1975 study of Hollywood leading up to and during the Vietnam War, film scholar Julian Smith notes that in the minds of most Americans, Vietnam has produced little popular art. He argues that while Hollywood and other artists seem to look away from Vietnam, the war found other ways to emerge in popular culture, a true phantom of Hollywood, surfacing in strange places, taking off its mask only briefly. In looking away, American culture looked inward, using addiction as a metaphor for a malaise that appeared both external and internal to the suffering national body. This sensation of haunting that McClancy locates in the television viewer of the Vietnam War, I argue, was as much about the fears of returning veterans as it was about the atrocities committed or the defeats suffered overseas. For while fictional representations of a triumphant American army or a moral and courageous soldier seem to disappear, although this is an image of an actual parade, these things seem to disappear during the Vietnam War. These narratives are replaced by metaphorical, fictional, and non-fictional representations of drug addiction, particularly in horror movies and novels. Kuzmarov argues that this transfer of attention away from the Vietnam War to Nixon's war on drugs was political strategy. Nixon's support for the myth of the addicted army deflected attention away from the failures of foreign policy abroad and the opposition to the Vietnam War at home by placing the blame for defeat in the hands of heroin-crazed soldiers and strung-out hippie protesters. I would add to this compelling argument that the narratives of addiction themselves had to be changed to allow for the kinds of massive interventions that Nixon was calling for. As the war on drugs shaped and replaced the war in Vietnam, so Vietnam affected not only the war on drugs, but also popular understandings of addiction as disease. By the 1980s, there would be a multitude of representations of the Vietnam veteran as this drug-crazed or insane person. But while the war was going on, there were in fact relatively few fictions created about Vietnam and its soldiers. To understand how changing notions of addiction and intervention manifested themselves during the war in Vietnam and Nixon's war on drugs, I argue that we need to look to a genre that allowed the metaphorical demons, hauntings, and phantoms to be spectacularly literalized. That genre is horror. I don't know, I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. Film scholar Robin Wood articulates clearly that the growth and increasing acceptance of horror as a serious genre is linked to the Vietnam War. This assessment was later echoed by the novelist Stephen King, whose prolific career was launched at the end of the Vietnam War during a wave of horror texts that were both literary and filmic and achieved critical and, in some cases, commercial success. Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Carrie, The Amityville Horror, The Shining, and Halloween all saw the horror situated within the family home, and most dealt with the will of an individual or individuals being corrupted or possessed by ghostly or demonic forces. In the context of the war on drugs, the rhetoric of addiction overlapped with the rhetoric of the horror story. By analyzing these horror texts, therefore, we can better understand how the war on drugs and the intervention were shaping cultural understandings of addiction and recovery. I've got a timeline here that matches up some very popular, commercially successful, or critically successful horror texts during that time, and I've read far more than are on this list, but I'm only going to talk about these tonight. This is what I call the big three plus the Mephisto Waltz. Probably no one here has heard of the Mephisto Waltz, right? Although if you have, I'd love to talk to you about it. Both addiction stories and horror stories interrogate the idea of surveillance in some form. There are interesting similarities among the mothers and wives who watched their husbands and sons for signs of addiction, the skeptical protagonists of Gothic horror stories, and the American public that watched television coverage of the Vietnam War. Encouraged to observe her husband and sons closely, the aware wife or mother was always in danger of seeing something that could be a sign of addiction. Yet the presence of an epidemic of addiction suggested that she had already not watched and perhaps could not watch closely enough. A veteran falling prey to addiction could then in part be blamed on the lack of what Arlen Specter called an aware parent, who could serve as, quote, the nation's first line of defense against the narcotic problem. This tension between seeing and not seeing is reproduced again in theories of horror. In his study of the aesthetics of horror, Terry Heller defines horror as the fear of anticipating and witnessing harm befalling others for whom we have some sympathy. The horror story uses devices such as narrative framing and suspense building to increase aesthetic distance, ensuring that the implied reader, so the reader that's created by a text, experiences fear. You know, you want to believe that they want you to feel fear, while the real reader, the flesh and blood person holding the book, is comfortably removed from any danger. You don't believe by reading the book that something terrible will happen to you. The war on drugs, then, described by the Nixon administration, can be read like a scary story, with sympathetic characters nervously watching loved ones for signs that they may be turning into monsters. The addiction narrative horror story parallel is reinforced by rhetoric that linked addicts and pushers with monsters and addiction with demonic possession or hell. It's not surprising then that many of the era's most popular horror texts center on characters, often wives and mothers, watching the evil within their homes and themselves. Of course, domestic horror and Gothic fiction weren't new in the 1970s. Published in 1954, you guys might be familiar with this one, William March's best-selling novel, The Bad Seed, centers on an overwhelmed mother who begins to question her daughter's suspicious behavior in the wake of a classmate's death. Though that novel shares similarities with novels like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Shining, the differences are indicative of the ways in which horror was employed to exercise fears of drug-addicted Vietnam veterans returning home. These novels displace the Vietnam War by including characters who either can't seem to remember the war is going on or who operate in a world where they can remain untouched by it. Equally important, however, are the thematic and generic differences in the ways evil is represented. While The Bad Seed declares the source of Rhoda Penmark's evil to be a hereditary predisposition to psychological problems, hence the title, the later novels find psychiatry and science to be insufficient to explain or treat the character's terrifying afflictions. As a result, they also question the effectiveness of different kinds of intervention. With the rest of my time tonight, I want to analyze a few of these novels to explain how horror during the Vietnam War was symptomatic of changing notions of addiction and agency, which were themselves deployed by the Nixon administration and the war on drugs to pull attention away from Vietnam. In the end, I hope to have shown that these texts suggest the war on drugs helped to revive belief in interventions that was shaken by the failure of the Vietnam War. In 1967, we have Ira Levin's novel, Rosemary's Baby. And this novel is sort of the text of the ones that I'm talking about here. It ushers in this renewed fascination with the Gothic horror stories, particularly people and places that are haunted and inhabited by evil spirits. You can kind of tell from the cover here, we've got a haunted-looking house. In the novel, Rosemary Woodhouse, and I'm going to use images from the 1968 Roman Polanski film because images of text from the book are not that interesting visually. So Rosemary Woodhouse finds her dream apartment in the Bramford, a building with a shady past and nosy neighbors. After moving in with her actor husband, Guy, Rosemary starts nesting and wants to have a baby. Guy, though focused on his career, eventually agrees. Rosemary endures a difficult pregnancy made worse by the seemingly kind interference of the Castavets, her elderly neighbors who drop in unannounced with nutritious smoothies and unsolicited advice. After the death of a friend, Rosemary begins to suspect that the Castavets are involved in some kind of devil worship and they want to steal her baby for ritual sacrifice. Her husband and her doctor think that she's losing it, so they sedate her until she delivers. She's told the child is stillborn, but she hears an infant crying in the Castavets' apartment. Determined to get her baby back, she makes her way into the apartment and finds a coven celebrating the birth of her son. When she sees the baby, she learns that Satan himself and not Guy is the father, and that Guy offered her body as an incubator in exchange for a successful career. Despite the horror of the situation, Rosemary claims her baby, and the novel closes with her determined to raise a good man. So if you've only seen the film, you don't know that ending, but at the ending, she's arguing with the coven over what they're going to call him. So she's definitely stepped in as mom. Published before the declaration of war on drugs, Rosemary's Baby is also the only novel of the three I will discuss tonight that features an explicit reference to the war in Vietnam, not the war on drugs. In order to get out of a recently signed lease and into the Bramford, Rosemary and Guy concoct a fictional tale about Guy being drafted to join a theater company on a USO tour. Rosemary otherwise only thinks about the conflict from time to time. The Pope comes to the United States and speaks against war, and that makes her cry. But she otherwise has a pretty shallow understanding of what's going on in the world. She makes a joke about how she's going to run away to Zanzibar, and someone tells her that that's not a country anymore. It's called Tanzania. So she's out of the loop. Once her pregnancy becomes difficult and painful, she withdraws further into her own world. The narrator, however, alludes to Rosemary's attempts to read the newspaper and try to, quote, be interested in students burning draft cards. Drugs appear in this plot as necessary to make things happen. Rosemary has to be drunk to be seduced, she has to be drugged to be raped, and she has to be sedated to deliver the child. The novel, however, never allows drugs to exist as simply functional. Addiction is always present too, suggesting the horrific loss of control that may follow the use of drugs or alcohol. Early in the novel, Rosemary's brother Brian, who had a drink problem, according to the novel, is mentioned as the only one of her family members who supported her move to New York City. Later, Rosemary meets Terry, a recovering drug addict whose addiction has made her susceptible to the Castevet's plot to inseminate an unsuspecting young woman. The specter of drugs alone obviously does not constitute a deep engagement with the subject of addiction. However, these allusions to drugs invite the reader to see that drug addiction is used as an explanation when there's seemingly unexplainable evil, one that the novel will address by supplying supernatural rather than psychological or sociological explanations. So no one is going to find out that someone is genetically predisposed to something. It will always be something supernatural. This replacement, I'm arguing, not only becomes ubiquitous in horror fiction of the time, but is the same kind of rhetorical move that's practiced by Nixon in his war on drugs Vietnam War conflation, which, because Nixon also wanted to dismantle Great Society programs and deny that the Vietnam War might be causing situational addiction, required characterizing addiction in ways that fell outside of the sphere of medical discourse. If we consider the criteria for addiction that were taking shape in the 1960s, Rosemary's pregnancy ultimately functions as a kind of addiction too. Doctors who began by studying alcoholism realized that chemically dependent people were susceptible to a variety of mind-altering substances. Attempts to describe addiction resulted in the overarching claims made by E.M. Jelinek that the addict could be identified as one who used drugs in a way to harm him or herself or others. Anticipating Johnson's definition of addiction as a break with reality, Rosemary's pregnancy also produces two levels of dissociation or disconnection. The aforementioned withdrawal from the outside world, so she doesn't know what's going on, but also there's a more internal disconnection. There's a disconnection between what she sees and how she interprets it. As Karen Valerius notes in her essay on Polanski's film adaptation, Rosemary suffers from a kind of reverse paranoia. She enacts the watchful behavior of a paranoiac, but she doesn't make the connections between interiority and exteriority that paranoia requires. So if you're paranoid, you have to watch things and think they're a plot. You can't just watch them. Instead of projecting fearful fantasies onto reality, Rosemary mistakes her real experiences and suspicions for fantasies and dismisses them. For instance, she partially wakes during her rape and she finds scratches and bruises on her body the following morning. But she still accepts Guy's explanation of the scratches and concludes that her actual memory of the rape was just a nightmare. In terms of the narrative, however, the strongest argument that can be made for seeing Rosemary as an addict figure must come from the novel's overt connection of Rosemary with Terry, the young woman who lives with the Castevets before she dies. Rosemary first becomes interested in Terry because she says she looks like a movie star and her husband's an actor. The resemblance to this movie star is close enough that Rosemary starts to watch Terry very closely to figure out who she really is. They become friends because of this, and Terry eventually confides in Rosemary that she also has a black sheep brother. The less said about him, the better, is all she says. Shortly after their meeting, Rosemary learns that Terry has committed suicide by jumping out of the Castevets' window. In the wake of her suicide, Rosemary frets that she will never understand what compelled Terry to jump. The novel, of course, provides satisfaction for both Rosemary and the reader by having Rosemary contemplate the same thing after she discovers the identity of her baby's father. Before that, however, Rosemary finds herself replacing Terry by becoming friends with the Castavets, so she feels sorry for them, and so she sort of steps in as their new pet project. She eventually replaces Terry again by becoming the incubator for the spawn of Satan. Throughout the novel, however, Rosemary misunderstands her plot or her position in the conspiracy. Until the very end, she sees herself as only the victim and not also the unwilling accomplice. To protect herself from this plot, she carefully watches Guy and tries to decipher clues about the Castavets. Rosemary's behavior in this respect calls to mind the aware wife, who was only recently being considered by addiction medicine to be more than a hindrance to treatment. This is a point of view shot from the film, which I think is great because there's not a ton of these, but you can see how closely she's studying Guy here. Though Guy does not go away to war, he does go away for performances, and Rosemary doubles down on her surveillance of him, questioning, quote, a disturbing presence of overlooked signals just beyond memory, signals of shortcomings in his love for her. He was an actor. Could anyone know when an actor was true and not acting? She begins to use his past performances as analogies for understanding his current behavior, and he makes her even more suspicious when he talks about how he's going to play a role where he's pretending to be someone, or he's playing someone who's pretending to be used to being disabled. And so this sort of throws her for a loop because it's roles within roles, so it's an Inception type role. This entrenches her epistemological uncertainty. She doesn't know what's going on. But all of her detective work leads her in the wrong direction. She uncovers the history of the Bramford and she figures out who the Castavets truly are, but she doesn't actually figure out what her husband has done. It's significant that Rosemary seems to perform both the roles of the addict and that of the observer. Vernon Johnson argues that the spouse of the alcoholic is, quote, as sick as the drunk. With every drunk there is a dry sick who is the mirror image. Thus, figuring Rosemary as an observer reifies her role as an addict, with the caveat that Rosemary's sickness is rooted not in her craving for a substance, but in her inability to interpret the signs of someone else's addiction. The novel concludes by drawing a link between addiction and inherent evil and suggesting that Rosemary, a fallible witness if not an addict herself, may have a blind spot for both. So as she gets closer to figuring out what's going on, she keeps thinking, I should call Brian, I should call my brother Brian. And this suggests that maybe she thinks Brian can do something to save her. Of course, she doesn't end up calling him, but he comes back at the end of the book. When she sees the face of the infant, she says, oh, he has this tiny chin and he kind of looks like Brian. So on the one hand, that could mean that these are her good genes being passed down into this child, but it's also interesting here that Rosemary is practicing a form of physiognomy, which is the study of faces. Physiognomy is a pseudoscience that doesn't exist anymore and was last seriously used about 100 years ago. But we know that Rosemary has also become extremely old-fashioned in her taste as time has progressed. She starts reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire for fun, and she says to a friend, nobody stops reading Dickens, which is also interesting. But Dickens is also a huge user of physiognomy in his descriptions of characters, and so it's interesting that if we read what she's doing here as a form of physiognomy and you look into physiognomy text, the size of a chin is an indication of a predisposition to alcoholism. So the significance of the baby's tiny chin might be more than just, you know, she's clearly his mother. The comparison of Brian with this infant raises questions about the disease model of addiction and its supposed separation from spiritual or moral registers, questions that will be raised again in later possession stories. Fred Mustard Stewart's 1969 The Mephisto Waltz, this is an early Rosemary's Baby imitator, locates addiction in the soul. After the body of Miles Clarkson, freelance writer, is taken over by the soul of Duncan Ely, Satan-worshipping concert pianist, Miles, who was before a heavy smoker, is able to quit smoking immediately. So once his soul is out, he's no longer addicted to cigarettes. Paula, who's Miles's wife and the Rosemary of this novel, is unable to quit, even though the Duncan Miles person is now really pressuring her because he doesn't like cigarettes. So she continues going back to cigarettes as things continue happening to her. She has a financial windfall, she wants a cigarette. She has sex, she wants a cigarette. Her daughter dies, she's sad, she wants a cigarette. And she has a headache that turns out to be a brain aneurysm, and she wants a cigarette. So she's very addicted. Like Rosemary, Paula witnesses some of the plot unfolding around her, but she dismisses these events as dreams and hallucinations. When Paula finally accepts that the Satanist plot is real, and she's accused of being high by the police when she tries to talk to them, and drunk by her friends. No human form of outside assistance can benefit Paula. Doctors conspire against her, law enforcement disbelieves her, and friends and family are easily manipulated by the charismatic Duncan. Paula is apparently influenced, she says it specifically, by the infamous Is God Dead issue of Time magazine, and she decides that Satan is real, but God isn't, and so she decides that she's going to become a Satanist. She decides that Satan is a kind of proto-hippie, and she decides that she's going to take over the body of Duncan's daughter, who is also his lover, to be with her husband's body that is now possessed by someone else's soul. There are no cures for diseases of the soul. And so if there's no help for the afflicted, then you have to join the Satanists, because that's really your only option at that point. Similarly, the end of Rosemary's Baby it's a very silly novel, I will just add, if you have the chance to read it. It's very silly. Similarly, the end of Rosemary's Baby fulfills the prophecy of the title. Rosemary chooses to own her baby, and she attempts to supply the good influence to counteract the bad. However, the novel has provided no reason to expect that Rosemary's intercessions will be successful. The narrative has evoked a sense of decadence, of things falling apart, through the Gothic setting of the Bramford, the breakdown in communications, and the inertia symbolized by the striking newspaper and transportation workers, and the delegitimizing of conventional figures of secular and sacred authority. The world of Rosemary's Baby is entropic, but Rosemary's perception of herself has shifted from passive victim to active agent of her and her infant's destiny. This shift in perception creates the aesthetic distance that Heller argues is necessary to horror fiction. The reader is not asked to sympathize with Rosemary's terrifying experience any longer. Instead, we're distanced from her through the increasing use of dialogue and the decreasing use of free indirect discourse, which is narration that closely mirrors a character's thought or speech patterns. This distance is closed in later iterations of demonic possession, particularly William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel, The Exorcist. Wives and mothers increasingly became targets of messages in the war on drugs, and their belief in the effectiveness of intervention would have to be reinforced. In reviews of both the novel and the film, The Exorcist is often considered the successor to Rosemary's Baby. Sometimes they'll say, Rosemary had a baby, and that baby was The Exorcist. Both deal specifically with demonic forces and the very young victims of them. However, while Rosemary's Baby focuses on a hidden evil gestating within Rosemary, her will is basically untouched by the Satanists. She's duped, but she's not possessed. The Exorcist is marked by its insistence on making evil vividly and violently present, further underscoring the potential for intervention. The novel centers on Chris McNeil, an actress, and her 12-year-old daughter, Reagan. While filming on location in Washington, D.C., Chris notices her daughter's behavior slowly changes. She becomes sullen, surly, even profane. At first, she thinks she's just a teenager. As Chris seeks the advice of medical doctors, Reagan's affliction worsens and she becomes violent. When Chris's director is thrown from Reagan's bedroom window, Chris becomes desperate. She seeks the advice of a couple of Jesuit priests she met while filming. The skeptical Father Karras, who recently lost his mother, is trained as a psychiatrist and reluctant to believe Reagan's affliction can't be explained by medical science. He eventually agrees to perform the ritual of exorcism in order to try to shock Reagan back to herself. The church gives him permission and assigns an experienced exorcist, Father Marin, to help. Karras remains unconvinced, but when Father Marin dies during the ritual, Karras becomes enraged. He physically attacks Reagan and invites the demon into himself before jumping out of the window and dying in the street. Reagan recovers and has almost no memory of the experience, but the witnesses are physically and emotionally scarred. In my reading, The Exorcist is the most important text for understanding the cultural reverberations of Nixon's war on drugs. This is a stridently anti-Great Society book, and the story depicts demonic possession as addiction, a disease the medical community has been unable to treat or define adequately. Under the Nixon administration's clever handling of the nationwide increase in drug abuse, particularly among military personnel, questions of the course of treatment were central to promoting rehabilitation. Questions of what actually causes addiction, questions that might encourage considering how social, economic, environmental factors are also contributing to the problem, were subordinated. The Exorcist furthers Nixon's agenda by conflating diagnosis with treatment and making understanding the causes of Reagan's possession not only impossible, but also irrelevant. Thus, for all of the unresolved questions about why the devil chooses Reagan, the plot works to make close observation by a mother and intervention by a third party is necessary to her recovery. So it's less important that we understand why this happened to her, and more importantly, we understand how to fix it. The visceral reaction film audiences had to William Friedkin's 1973 film adaptation of the novel can also be read as an index of the success of the ideology of intervention. As in Rosemary's Baby, drugs and alcohol at first seemed superficial in this plot. We actually begin in the Middle East among the poppied hills of Iraq. And then when we're back in the United States, Chris McNeil is working on a film about student protests in Washington, D.C. Her director is the legendary Burke Dennings, who is famous for his films and infamous for his alcoholism. But addiction is remote. It's like the far-off hills of the foreign land, or it's easily deniable because Chris says she doesn't believe Dennings is an alcoholic, he's just a heavy drinker. Drugs also have functional roles to play in the narrative. When Chris's daughter Reagan begins acting strangely, thrashing and mutilating herself, she's sedated with drugs and increasing doses of Librium. Whenever Chris exhausts the resources of one therapeutic approach, the doctors or the priest or the policeman say, well, have you considered, could she be on drugs? Apparently, addiction resides in a liminal space between physiology and psychology, between spirituality and criminality. Drugs and addiction are one manifestation of evil in a world that the sympathetic Detective Kinderman describes as having a massive nervous breakdown. Significantly, the novel gives no explanation for why Reagan would be targeted by demonic entities, other than playing with the Ouija board, which Chris states that she also played with as a child, and which my grandmother would never let me play with because of that movie. Reagan seems to have no connection whatsoever to the occult. In an essay on Friedkin's film adaptation, Michael Dempsey notes that both the film and novel laboriously discredit all other explanations for the girl's condition, and it's definitely laboriously in the novel. They run through every possibility. This makes spontaneous, unprovoked demonic possession the only possible explanation. Rather than dissuade a reading of Reagan's possession as analogous to addiction, this lack of context for the affliction resonates with the developing denial of social and environmental factors influencing addiction. Despite the suggestions of Father Karras and Detective Kinderman that drugs can actually cause all kinds of seemingly supernatural changes in a person, the reader has no real reason to question what's wrong with Reagan. She is clearly possessed. The narrative is grounded in Chris's perspective, and Blatty takes pains to prove that Chris is a very attentive reader of people. She's described as naturally inquisitive and able to juice people and wring them out and pin them down. She's skeptical of doctors and not religious. She has apparently no bias for either a medical or a spiritual explanation of Reagan's malady. Her general skepticism and willingness to believe in Reagan's possession by a demon should be enough to convince the reader too. Because the reader never seriously entertains the possibility that drugs could have caused this affliction, allusions to drugs invite the reader to see addiction as analogous to possession. So the fact that Blatty keeps bringing in characters who say, are you sure it's not drugs? It's sure it's not drugs? You sure it's not drugs? He's asking us to think about drugs. We can't not think about drugs. Nowhere is this clearer than in the subplot involving Elvira, the daughter of Chris's housekeepers. Carl, the male half of the Swiss couple who live with McNeils, is introduced early on as mysterious and, to Chris's mind, unreadable. Believing that he knows something more when Burke Dennings is killed, Detective Kinderman has Carl followed, and he discovers that Carl does have a secret. He has a daughter, Elvira, who is a heroin addict that he's quietly supporting. Almost unbelievably, Carl has let his wife believe that his daughter died so that he can spare her the pain of seeing Elvira's continued decline. In this respect, Carl mirrors Chris, who hides her daughter's affliction from her estranged husband and works to conceal Reagan's condition from the police, who wish to question her about Denning's death. However, like the medical and spiritual quest to cure Reagan, Kinderman's official investigation of Denning's murder is technically futile. He discovers Denning's murderer, Reagan, but he does not intend to press charges. Instead of arresting Carl or Elvira for possessing drugs or purchasing them, he extends help. Elvira accepts his offer to enter treatment, and the novel ends with both Elvira and Reagan in recovery. The parallels between these narratives reinforce a correlation between addiction and possession. They also juxtapose the behaviors of Chris and Carl, who both approach their daughter's illnesses in very different ways. Chris is vigilant and tenacious. Carl is enabling and timid. Both, however, require the assistance of external authorities. The process of diagnosing Reagan's possession dramatizes the tensions between the medical and legal authorities in the war on drugs. A war on drugs is justified in part because apparently medical knowledge is not enough to contain addiction. This is a great still from the film in which you see Chris seated sort of Last Supper-like around a room of psychiatrists. Nixon insisted that earlier efforts to stem drug abuse were insufficient because they did not coordinate between law enforcement and doctors. So people that approached it only as a criminal justice problem weren't doing enough, and people that approach it only as a public health problem aren't doing enough. The novel, too, suggests that possession exceeds the limits of any single approach by offering a sustained critique of the medical establishment in the first half of the book, during which readers see doctors unable to diagnose Reagan, unable to save Karis's mother, and during which readers find out that Chris has not trusted doctors since the death of her son, Jamie. Doctors are surprised by Reagan's responses and unsatisfied with their own hypotheses. Chris is continually frustrated by their inability to diagnose Reagan, and at one point, Dr. Klein admits that there are limits to medical knowledge, despite the certainty with which doctors pronounce diagnoses. However, The Exorcist does not really present a straightforward or unequivocal takedown of modern medicine. In fact, it allows some victories to the doctors and denies them to the priests. It's important to point out that while the doctors initially fail to diagnose Reagan, their efforts at treating her do not. They're able to prescribe sedatives that calm the demon. Don't know how that works, but it does. In sedating and feeding her, they're actually able to prolong her life. They also are able to draw the demon out through hypnosis. Furthermore, it's a group of psychiatrists, this group, who eventually prescribe the ironic exorcism that Chris seeks for Reagan. Chris remains skeptical of the suggestion, but the doctors have shown through their deductive process that there is nothing physically wrong with Reagan. They even give her condition a name, somnambuliform possession, that contains the name of the condition that she actually has. Medicine has done the work of naming and defining the problem and suggesting the course of treatment, but it lacks the authority to carry it out and remains silent on the question of etiology or cause. The church has only slightly more to say on the subject of etiology in this case, and on almost every front, the spiritual treatment of Reagan, the actual exorcism, is less reliable and less effective. Karis notes with trepidation that priests often went mad, died, or even became possessed themselves during the performance of exorcisms. Because he believes in paranormal phenomena like extrasensory perception and telekinesis, Karis constantly doubts the behaviors of Reagan that would otherwise constitute proof of possession. Karis's skepticism stems from his training as a psychiatrist. He is familiar with autosuggestive disorders, which is apparently when you believe you have something because it has been suggested to you. And he knows that Reagan has in her home a book that talks about demonic possession. So he doesn't know if she's read the book or not, but if she does anything that appears in that book, it could be proof of possession, but it could also be proof that she read the book. So he's in a bind. At first, he tells Chris she should just hire actors to perform the mock exorcism. But eventually, Karis arrives independently at the same conclusion as the secular psychiatrist. He agrees to perform the same ironic exorcism the psychiatrist prescribed that Chris sought that he initially refused to participate in, and he agrees to do it for precisely the reasons the secular psychiatrist thought it would be effective. Significantly, what convinces Karras to pursue the ironic exorcism is not the medical evidence, nor what he can see or hear directly, but his interpretation of a re-represented text, a recording of Reagan's voice played backwards. This is him having his revelation. Come on. There we are. He accepts reality only when it's played back for him. The juxtaposition of Karras and the medical doctors establishes two key themes of the war on drugs. First, rather than negating the authority of the medical establishment, the novel imbues it with something more than medical authority, an authority that is at the same time spiritual and ironically spiritual. Second, it places Reagan's disease outside the bounds of any single field's understanding. She, like drug addicts in most eras, is pursued and investigated by priests, doctors, and policemen. In the age of intervention, however, confronting addiction cannot be accomplished without the assistance of culture. Thus, the actors, directors, aspiring screenwriters, and movie buffs who populate the narrative world prepare the reader for an intervention that is grounded in spectacle and performance. Karras's procedure illuminates a central premise of the Johnson intervention, that the representation of reality by others can reconnect the addict with the reality that he's necessarily severed from. Johnson argues addicts needed more than anything else to be confronted by reality through sound movies or tapes, he recommends. This would show them that reality is not what they have been believing it was. However, while Johnson argues that this form of reality therapy can be useful to the addict, he also acknowledges that the ones closest to the alcoholic who have actually seen and heard his or her behavior without the distorting effects of alcohol are, as I mentioned earlier, as sick as the addicted. Thus, it's not the physiological symptoms of alcoholism like blacking out or having euphoric recall that prevent the alcoholic from accepting reality. There's something else inherent in Johnson's concept of addiction that makes everyone touched by it cut off from reality. Karras is thus a victim of the disease because he's also an observer of it. Though Reagan has been linked with addiction and drug usage throughout the novel, it is Karras who is positioned to be the character in need of an intervention. Father Lancaster Marin, the experienced exorcist who comes to help, tells Karras, "I think the demon's target is not the possessed, it is us, the observers." And that's actually the only thing that makes sense as to why this has happened to Reagan McNeil, is to have this epiphany come about for Father Karras, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Marin assumes that the purpose of possession is to show the observers that human beings are unworthy of God's love. Karras is partially convinced by Reagan's levitation. But he only experiences euphoric restoration of faith when he becomes the afflicted. So even seeing this happen, even seeing Father Marin die, does not make him suddenly fully believe that this is happening. He only fully believes it's happening in the moment between attacking Reagan and the demon going into himself. Once that happens, once he's drawn the demon into himself, he's able to follow the path of the alcoholic Burke Dennings. He jumps out the window to his death on the street, where passers-by assume that he too must have been drunk. The narrative moves out of Karras's perspective so that we're downstairs with the members of the McNeil household when this fatal act takes place. The exorcist thus links the addicted and afflicted with the witnesses in a way similar to the Johnson intervention, in a way that makes possible the surveillance necessary for the war on drugs. In the Johnson intervention, success is not measured by freedom from addiction, but acceptance of its reality. So too can the exorcist's unique success, the cultural work it does, be understood by virtue of the novel and then the film's ability to convince readers and viewers of its reality. Anecdotes about the reading experience of The Exorcist, there aren't actually that many. I searched for them when I was first researching this project. But there are some. People were haunted by it. It made them want to sleep with the lights on. You know, it's a horror novel. But by virtue of its medium, the film's effects on the audience were as spectacular as the film itself. Tales of audiences screaming, fainting, vomiting, even dying during the film reproduced in the moviegoer the symptoms of possession. If you go on YouTube, they actually used audience reactions in a advertisement for the film shortly after it came out, and they're fascinating to watch. Subsequent fears. So people went and saw this movie and then they were afraid that things would happen to them. Fears that they could become possessed or even were possessed sent viewers to psychiatrist offices and resulted in the creation of a new disease entity, cinematic neurosis. And as far as I know, this is the only psychological disorder the origin of which can be traced to a specific movie. Cinematic neurosis is, in a sense, a fitting testament to the success of The Exorcist in linking text and disease, a linkage that is crucial to the emerging understanding of addiction as break with reality. The Exorcist also instructs readers and viewers how to respond to the disease and the pernicious text. Be observers, but not interpreters. The story of The Exorcist is not easy to follow all the time, but audiences sought it out for its visual spectacle, not the narrative complexity. One New York Times article on the Exorcist phenomenon claims they wait hours to be shocked. And in fact, some people would wait hours to see the film, not sit through it all the way, and then wait hours to try to see it again and not sit through it all the way. Commentary on the audiences notes the amount and kind of screaming and whether people vomited or fled the theater. The intense visceral reactions to the film precluded any discussion among moviegoers as to the nature of Reagan's affliction, just as the affliction itself undermines the doctors, Chris's, Karras's, and Kinderman's attempts to interpret it. So basically, people are not talking about the nature of Reagan's possession. They're talking about what happened in the audience around them when they go see this film. Director William Friedkin cut Blatty's significant subplot involving Elvira, which is a shame, and her heroin addiction from the film. But the investment of a moral quality in the disease entity remained. The apparent link between addiction and possession, between the war on drugs and the war in Vietnam, appears in the horror films that followed it. Now, I would love it if you guys had seen these films that I'm going to mention really quickly. In 1974's Death Dream, anyone seen that one? No. Canadian film. Also known as Dead of Night, a young soldier killed in Vietnam returns as a zombie. Unlike the prototypical brain-seeking zombie, however, Andy's symptoms are sullenness, irritability, and nodding off. All behaviors aware parents were told to be on guard against. I don't know how accurate, other than the nodding off, this is for heroin addiction, but I think that's what they're going for here. George Romero's Martin humanized the monstrous vampire, this is a 1977 film, by making him an affable teenager who, compulsion to drink blood aside, seems plagued more by the generation gap than the evil his religious uncle insists dwells within him. And if I hadn't told you, you probably wouldn't know that this wasn't a movie about drugs, but it's not, it's about vampires. In the 1980s, both horror and cultural representations of Vietnam would undergo radical transformations. In addition, President Ronald Reagan would redeclare the war on drugs and redefine intervention to focus on preemptive strikes. As a way to conclude my analysis of this era, though, I want to turn briefly to Stephen King's 1977 novel, The Shining. This novel follows the Torrance family through an ill-fated stay at the Overlook Hotel. Jack Torrance secures a job as caretaker of the Colorado Resort Hotel over the 6-month-long off-season, bringing his wife Wendy and his son Danny to stay with him, hoping that the solitude and imposed sobriety, because there's no alcohol left in this hotel, will help him repair his relationships with them and allow him to restart his writing career. Wendy and Jack are also concerned because Danny has been acting strangely. He's been experiencing fainting spells and talking to and about what seems to be a malevolent imaginary friend named Tony. We learn early on, though, that Danny actually has a benign psychic ability, much like the hotel's head chef, Dick Halloran, who warns Danny that the hotel is a difficult place for people who shine like they do. As Danny experiences terrifying run-ins with the hotel's spirits, Jack becomes obsessed with the hotel's history, and he gives up working on his writing and bonding with his family. The tension escalates until Jack snaps. He attempts to kill both Wendy and Danny, but is able to overcome the spirits that possess him long enough to kill himself and take the hotel with him. Like the novels discussed above, The Shining is a gothic horror story set during the Vietnam War, though you would never know it from reading it. And it spends nearly half of its pages like The Exorcist, suggesting that the vulnerable child at the center is perhaps at the mercy of demonic forces. However, rather than deal with addiction on a metaphorical level by equating it to possession, The Shining literalizes it and makes Jack Torrance's alcoholism central. His addiction is the reason that they're moving into the Overlook Hotel. It's the force that drives the conflict between Jack and Wendy. It's the source of his internal struggles. And it's also a semi-supernatural conductor for the evil emanating from the hotel. In other words, the novel is far more concerned with Jack's alcoholism than with the source of evil in the Overlook Hotel. The Shining firmly establishes a spiritual or moral dimension of addiction and reinforces the surveillance imperatives of the intervention. The Shining is told through shifting perspectives, so we get chapters from Jack's perspective and then from Danny's and then from Wendy's, and we keep going back and forth. So we have access both to the people witnessing stuff, but we also have access to the addict's thought, the alcoholic's thoughts. We begin with the embittered Jack Torrance, and I'm using the 1980 Stanley Kubrick film, but I also have a slide from the 1997 Stephen King TV miniseries, and it's necessary to talk about both. This is Jack in the bar here, if you can see him with his head in his hands. The novel then shifts to Wendy, who worries about Jack and their son Danny. Danny worries too, mostly about his father, but also about the signs that are shown to him by Tony, an invisible entity that Wendy and Jack think of as Danny's imaginary friend. And readers might think of him at first as something like a Captain Howdy, who is the imaginary friend of Reagan in The Exorcist. But unlike Reagan, who communicates with Captain Howdy through a Ouija board, Danny is 5 years old and he can't read. The novel frequently presses on Danny's illiteracy to create both tension and narrative distance. Tony will send Danny visions of written text from time to time, but Danny can't decipher it. Similarly, Danny is able to read people's thoughts, but when he tries to read his father, he finds the words divorce and suicide, but he doesn't know what they say. He just knows that they're bad. At the Overlook, Danny pushes himself to learn to read, so that's his project for the winter, while Jack pushes himself to complete a stage adaptation of a novella he had written. Both Danny and Jack consider these acts of interpretation essential to survival and more specifically to keeping Jack's alcoholism at bay. So it's kind of poignant actually that Danny really thinks if he can just figure out how to read, his dad will quit drinking. In this novel, addiction emerges as a disease entity dependent not on an individual's continued ingestion of a substance, but on the personality and behavior of the addict as it is interpreted by others. Through Jack's eyes, the reader sees the return of his alcoholism, even though the Overlook Hotel has no alcohol in it. The reader also sees this through Wendy's eyes, as she worries about, quote, the most frightening thing, vaporous and unmentioned, perhaps unmentionable. All of Jack's drinking symptoms had come back, one by one, all but the drink itself. Wendy concedes that she had never been able to read Jack very well, but this statement has to strike the reader as strange, given that we can also see inside Jack's mind, and so we know he is thinking about drinking all the time. She's basically reading his mind. She seems to be reading him quite well. Without the physical proof of his drinking, though, she's hesitant to call his behavior alcoholic. And by not recognizing that in the disease model of addiction, you don't necessarily need a substance, Wendy is effectively blind to Jack's consequent susceptibility to possession. So she sees everything and she's right about everything, but she says, but there's no alcohol here. And so that makes her dismiss everything that she's actually seeing. Like Terry and Rosemary's Baby, Jack is an easy target for demonic forces because of his addiction. Before allowing him to actually go to those fantastic parties that went on in the hotel, the ghosts try to appeal to him because he's a writer by giving him a scrapbook. And they put this scrapbook in the basement where Wendy won't find it and she won't see Jack reading it. Jack becomes obsessed with the scrapbook, and his consumption of that replaces his previously productive work in adapting his novella. The reader learns that the history of the Overlook Hotel is also a history of addiction in America, the hotel serving as the locus for organized crime and obviously rum running, decadent Prohibition-era consumption, addicts of all stripes ranging from innocent victims to evil libertines, and drunken, perhaps suicidal writers up to and including Jack. Consuming this history of addiction becomes addictive as Jack craves consumption of the scrapbook and begins to feel guilty as if he'd been drinking secretly. To goad Jack into murdering his family, a ghostly bartender makes Jack martinis and he drinks them. As I mentioned before, there's no alcohol in the hotel, so what are these martinis really? Are they spirits or are they just vodka? Jack seems to believe he's drunk, but his drinking also invites possession, and the evil spirits take over his body. He seems to be both drunk and possessed at times. And Danny's understanding of Jack's situation by the end, while it might be read as a metaphor for the dual personality of the addict, suggests that Jack has also been taken over. He says, "You're not my daddy, you're it." Unlike in Levin's novel, The Shining goes so far as to hypothesize why Jack's alcoholism makes him susceptible to this invasion. Jack's father was a violent alcoholic, suggesting both a genetic and psychological basis for addiction. And Jack himself, despite ceasing drinking, has not sought any therapeutic treatment. Jack is what Alcoholics Anonymous call a dry drunk. He acknowledges that he will always be an alcoholic and claims that it had nothing to do with willpower. But even as he seems to espouse the tenets of the disease concept, Jack clearly uses his alcoholism to exonerate himself for the loss of his job, a drunk driving accident, and breaking Danny's arm. As Jack's personality changes or reverts to his alcoholic one, suspense is created along two themes in the novel: the horror of seeing versus the horror of not seeing, and the necessity for external verification or intervention. Characters reiterate the notion that not seeing or not understanding is more terrifying than the alternative. Wendy is shocked by the ghastly appearance of the possessed Jack, but it was 100 times worse not to be able to see him. Earlier in the novel, both Jack and Danny are menaced by giant topiaries. So if you have seen the made-for-TV version of this that Stephen King directed, that's where you'll find these, other than in the novel. And also, I secretly love that, even though it's got its problems. So these giant topiaries move closer whenever you look away. Stanley Kubrick replaced the topiaries with a hedge maze, which looks a lot less silly in film. But in the novel, the topiaries are actually pretty terrifying. One can arrest their progress with one's gaze, but the thing was you couldn't watch all of them, not all at once. One can never watch enough to arrest the progress of the narrative's horror. When Jack does see things that make him question his skepticism, the lack of external verification allows him to dismiss it. He destroys the family's only connections to the outside world, their snowmobile and their CB radio, so as to keep external reality at bay. Danny, on the other hand, telepathically calls for Mr. Halloran, the hotel chef who shares Danny's psychic ability. Thwarted by turbulent snowstorms and the killer topiaries, Halloran almost does not reach the Overlook to help. Once he arrives, however, he's not able to do anything to stop Jack. Jack attacks him and he regains consciousness in time to find an injured Wendy, but not to prevent the final confrontation between Jack and Danny. Wendy, having accepted that Jack's alcoholism and the hotel's spirits are working together, tells Halloran it's too late. Now he can only help himself. Danny has enacted the principles of self-help all along. His doctors, noting that Danny's middle name was Anthony, had earlier suggested that Tony was a name Danny gave to his conscience. As in The Exorcist, the doctors are partially right. Tony is a future Danny, appearing to himself in visions in an attempt to intervene, to prevent the family from reaching rock bottom. Danny's intervention on behalf of Jack is less successful than Tony's, though he manages to bring Jack back to his senses long enough for a moment. And in that moment, Jack lets Danny go before bringing about the destruction of the Overlook. In my talk tonight, I've argued that the reemergence of the horror genre, previously interpreted as simply being about feelings of guilt about Vietnam, can also be interpreted in the context of Nixon's war on drugs, the campaign which directed public attention away from Vietnam while shaping attitudes about addiction treatment. I'd like to conclude by highlighting a few themes that emerge in horror texts of the era vis-a-vis addiction and suggest how changes in cultural understandings of addiction might be inferred from those. First, by making addiction adjacent to or interchangeable with demonic possession, all of these novels end up reinstituting a moral disease or a moral dimension in the disease concept. Whether addiction makes a character more susceptible to evil spirits or a possessed person is mistakenly believed to be on drugs, the implication is that there is something evil inherent in addiction. While the possessed may be, as in the case of Reagan McNeil, entirely innocent of wrongdoing, and while the novel may work to make clear the distinction between willed and unwilled actions, the possessed and addicted body is described as monstrous, and the possessed addicted person is in danger of becoming a non-person. Vile, putrid, craving disgusting things, unrecognizable. These descriptors so removed the possessed, addicted character from the mainstream that only a complete purgation of the body and soul will restore him or her. The extremity of this view discourages compromises, things such as harm reduction measures like methadone maintenance in fighting addiction. Horror during this era also viewed medical approaches to the problem with skepticism. Doctors and psychiatrists throughout the novels I've mentioned here are shown to be limited, inept, obstinate, and even cruelly unreceptive to the complaints of witnesses. Undermining rational secular authority is a common theme in Gothic fiction. However, medical science is unintentionally or ironically correct in its diagnoses, with the exception of Dr. Saperstein, who, spoiler alert, is in the coven, so not the best OBGYN. Doctors in horror texts are redeemed by their collusion with spiritual and legal authority. In The Exorcist, the medical course of treatment, the shock exorcism, is the same one the priests embark upon. The law, symbolized by Detective Kinderman, looks the other way long enough to allow the treatment to work. And at the end, priest and policemen go off to the movies together. And sadly, we don't have that in Friedkin's version, but that's the actual conclusion of the novel, is the policeman and the priest going to the movies together. The questioning of medical authority in these texts, therefore, is not meant to undermine that authority, but to consolidate it in a medical, legal, spiritual amalgam. In these stories, as authority is consolidated, the supernatural also serves as a means to discredit sociological or environmental causes of evil. Levin's novel considers the systemic basis of evil by alluding to communications breakdowns, racial inequality, and civic unrest, but Rosemary's decision to attempt to nurture the evil out of her son suggests a commensurate unwillingness to acknowledge the supremacy of these socially and environmentally determined factors. The Exorcist and The Shining obscure these bases through strictly supernatural and psychological explanations. In Blatty's novel, epigraphs referring to the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, organized crime, and Vietnam suggest that a supernatural evil is at the root of all of these atrocities, and that they are best understood to be afflictions similar to what Reagan experiences. In undoing Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives, including the war on poverty, Nixon promoted an understanding of social ills as the results of individual agents, not systemic racism or economic inequality. Intervention is another piece of this puzzle. With evil emanating from the supernatural and authority consolidated in a medical, legal, spiritual entity, the gulf between the two is bridged by witnesses. In each of the texts that I talked about at length, a woman, a wife, and or a mother questions the skeptical, rational explanation of the authorities. In the case of the earlier novels, the witnesses insist through their continued surveillance of children and husbands on the necessity of an extraordinary intervention. Vernon Johnson's approach to addiction was unique because it challenged a dominant narrative that addicts must proceed through the stages of addiction and reach a rock bottom before they can recover. The intervention replaced the rock bottom with the agency of the witnesses, emanating from their capacity to represent crises before they happen. While the interventions of these novels don't always succeed, we can discern the same movement as female characters attempt to wrest control back of their lives by insisting that the dominant reality of the story world is false. Rosemary Woodhouse, Chris McNeil, and Wendy Torrance all deny rational explanations of supernatural behavior. They insist that reality is different from what others have been believing. The problem of addiction was obviously not solved by Nixon's war on drugs. I hope that I've shown tonight that drug epidemics are also stories that we tell. They're cultural narratives that influence our understandings not only of addiction and recovery, but also the degree to which we believe in medical, religious, or governmental authorities to intervene on our behalf. Many people believe that the war on drugs has been a complete failure, but it has succeeded in important ways that we are still feeling the effects of. It succeeded in convincing people across the political spectrum that addiction was a problem for legislators rather than doctors to address. It succeeded in making people believe that addiction was something that could be eradicated and exorcised completely from the national body. It also succeeded in bolstering the concept of intervention as a viable therapeutic technique, giving a voice and agency to people who once felt powerless to help their suffering loved ones. It is important to consider how the stories we tell about addiction and recovery influence this understanding so that we can be truly helping other people, not merely becoming dependent on the hope that we can. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any, but I know I also talked forever. Sure.
As I recall,
I don't think so, because I think one of the things that Jeremy Kuzmarov argues in his book is that this idea of the myth of the addicted army still exists today. That most people don't know that it was situational addiction, and that most soldiers who used drugs in Vietnam were not addicted and ceased using when they came back to the United States and got back into their families and their regular lives. So to me, it does not seem that that idea of that, I don't think that was ever rectified, basically. And then in the 1980s, when you have Ronald Reagan's crusade to sort of rehabilitate the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War veteran, although I think in some ways his intentions were good in trying to restore the honor of the people that fought in the Vietnam War, he was also still playing to that same stereotype that, like, look how badly we treated them, and then they became, you know, these horrible people. So it really didn't actually, he didn't actually address that myth. He kind of just used it in the service of trying to rehabilitate the war itself rather than to rehabilitate the image of the soldiers. Yeah. I think that horror movies have, like, they're almost like a sponge for cultural anxieties. Horror movies are a way of expressing, and novels obviously, although in terms of current horror, I'm much more versed on films than novels. But it's a way of expressing whatever the cultural anxiety is. So the movie Get Out, which I unfortunately haven't seen yet, but have heard great things about, that's really playing to our, you know, the horror of racism and the anxiety and fear that that causes in our modern society. I don't think that the drug narrative, the addiction narrative, is as prevalent in modern horror movies, in part because I think we have just sort of accepted addiction narratives as a viable thing of entertainment. And so we can just go see a bunch of movies about drug addicts if we want instead. So does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Yeah. So there's lots of great theorists of horror that talk about why we go from one type of horror movie into the slasher movie. My analysis of Reagan's war on drugs does not continue using horror, because one of the things that's unique about Ronald Reagan's war, or more precisely Nancy Reagan's war on drugs, is that they said, let's make a bunch of cultural products that are specifically about this thing. And so that's when we see the creation of the very special episode. That didn't exist before Ronald Reagan. The very special episode is something that I really want to have. I want to be the person that discovers this, but I think the first use of that phrase is in TV Guide in 1983 to promote an episode of Different Strokes that Nancy Reagan is on. And so for why horror moves in that particular direction, it's complicated. There are people that have done studies of horror that look at the influence of the women's movement in the late 1970s and how that affects horror. There's also the fact that, like, The Exorcist is not only a blockbuster because it was so spectacular, but it was distributed differently than other films had ever been. It had sort of nationwide release, which other films had not really done at that point, and that affected how films were released and produced as well. So there's a lot of factors, but I do think that in the 1980s we get addiction narratives in different kinds of stories because the Reagans really explicitly wanted to use their star power, because they were actors, to shape the narrative. Yeah, so the Stepford Wives in my horror timeline is not one that I would say is necessarily about addiction, although you could do a very deep dive into it and pick some things out. But that's Ira Levin's follow-up to Rosemary's Baby. So he writes Rosemary's Baby and then the Stepford Wives. And so he's clearly capitalizing on the idea that horror is in the home. It's in the suburban neighborhood. And that coalesces with the new ideas about addiction that people were trying to disseminate. They were trying to say, you think addiction is the homeless person that you see on the streets that you imagine has all these problems and looks like a drug addict, but the real drug addict is the mom that's, taking the uppers to get through her day with her kids, or the dad that has, 6 beers when he comes home. And so there was also this idea that, like, what's really scary is what's familiar, the family, the home, the suburbs. I haven't reread Stepford Wives in several years, but I would actually, that makes me want to go back and look at it again. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.